Hey everyone, my name is Sycra Yasin, and in this talk, what I'm going to be doing is covering how to color using a technique that is very efficient, and also how to develop a color sense. And this is something that's it's eluded me for a long time. Like, how do you create good colors or interesting colors? When I started out, many artists, I used knowledge of color theory to really help me. You might recognize like the color wheel, and you think about color like, red is opposite of green and things like this. And it worked to a point. You can make color schemes that are pretty okay. But I always would see, friends of mine, some of them would have like very interesting colors. They really stood out. And when I would ask them, how do you choose those colors? They were never able to give me a really straight answer. They would say things like, I just experiment, or I don't know, I just get this feeling. I feel like this goes. So for me, I'm a very analytical person more. I like to understand things and break them down into something I can replicate over and over again. And so I spent a long time trying to figure a technique that would help me develop this sense. And I did, and that's what I'm going to also share with you. So the talk is basically broken down into these two parts. One part is how to effectively make a bunch of color variations very, very easily in Adobe Photoshop. And then the other is how to develop a color sense to make very interesting color choices, not just, the predictable color choices. So I'm going to be working off this character sheet I made of a character of mine. And the coloring technique that's very simple is something like this. I have these this character, and let's say I wanted to give her green hair. Boop, with one click, you can see all the hair turn green. So, it's very efficient as a method of coloring. See, I can just like click an area and it just turns that color. So very easy to make color variations. This is great for character design because if you want to show a bunch of different variations, give the director options of like, you want to go in this direction or this direction. It's you can easily make a lot of variations. So how am I doing that? So let me just walk you through the process of how I made something like that. So you start with a sketch. I'm just going to do a very rough sketch. And this is just to get some lines down. So we start with a sketch of a person. No, it could be anything, In this case, I do characters. So I'll make a person. And let's give them some hair. All right, so basic character. So these are the lines. You have the lines on their own layer. And I like to set the layer to multiply. So whatever is underneath, like the lines kind of show through. So now what I'm going to do is I use the lasso tool. And I'm going to make a mask of this character, like a shape defining the perimeter of, like the character, like a silhouette. And the most important thing with this is for whatever tool we use, and we'll be using lasso, magic wand, and paint bucket, you want this anti-alias to be turned off. That's really important. So the difference between aliasing and anti-aliasing is if I have anti-alias on and I make a selection Let's use something a bit darker so it's easier to see. Okay, you can see the line is very crisp. There's just like white and green. If I have anti-aliasing on, then you'll notice if I zoom really close, there's like this fuzzy quality. And so you're not just getting two colors like green and then the background. You're getting like green, a bit lighter green, a bit lighter green. So this is what we don't want. And the reason is because we want everything to be like either one color or not. We don't want any in-between things, or this doesn't work. So basically, you've got the anti-aliasing on every tool that you'll be using. And also the tolerance has to be set to 0. What this means is that you'll be selecting exactly a color. Like if your tolerance is high, then let's say you pick green and a sort of a close green, almost the same green, not quite the same green, it'll pick up both of those as the same green. We want it so it's super specific. And that just makes sure that we are only picking the color we want and not another color that happens to be close but isn't. So I'm just going to lasso around this character. Now, if you have more time, you make this very precise, but I'm just doing this as a quick example. And, you know, sometimes it's okay to be fast with this, like you just lasso as best as you can, and then you fix the areas that are a little bit off rather than like trying to get it perfect on your first try. So now I have this lassoed silhouette, which is very clean, right? Like, oh, did I? I think I had anti-aliasing still. No, don't want that. Okay, so let's give that another shot. Make sure everything, the anti-aliasing is off. And for the sake of this, let's just say this is good, right? It's a bit worse than the first attempt, but okay, anti-aliasing is off and we've got, you know, decent selection of this character. And so this is like the base. Everything is going to work off this. So now what I do is I select areas. So let's say I want to select the hair. All right, so I'm going to just lasso around where I want the hair to be. And this is including some of the eyebrows. And I'm going to use a paint bucket tool. I'm going to pick a color. It doesn't matter what the color is, so long as it's different. And I'm going to fill. So here we're more concerned with separating elements. They don't have to be, like, don't worry about picking colors yet, like making, oh, I want brown hair or I want blonde hair or anything like that. We're just interested in separating the elements. And I'm doing this all on the same layer, and anti-aliasing is on all of them. So in this case, we just have the hair, we have the eyes, and a little bit of a shirt. So eyes can be, again, any color, really doesn't matter. And the shirt can be any color. Okay, so that looks pretty terrible. And that's fine, because all we wanted to do is separate it. At this point, now that the colors are separated, what I would do is I would duplicate this using Control-J, duplicate this layer, turn the bottom one off. And that's just so I have a backup in case I need to go back, in case I screw up. And the only real way to screw up in this technique is if I do something like this. If I color the hair this yellow color, and I color the skin this yellow color or any other element. Now, if I change the color of this, I change like the hair, I change the color of the skin as well. So that's like the one thing you don't want to do. However, if I made the hair this color and I made the skin like sort of that color, but slightly different, like it's close, but it's not identical, then I can still change the colors and it's just fine. So that's kind of the main part of this, which is just separating your colors, having them on their own layer, having line art separate, and then the only other thing is, let's say I wanted to add shadows to this character, and I wanted it so no matter which version I did, which color version I used, the shadows are always the same. So let's treat this as if there's two versions. This, I mean, kind of looks like an ogre or something. And this guy. Okay. So what I would do is I would make a new layer and probably a new group. And you hit Control G to make things a group. I'm not going to go into too many details about Photoshop. This is an intermediate lesson. So I'm assuming you have a general grasp on the program. I'm going to select this. I hit Control and click this portrait, so I get a selection, and this creates a mask. I hit the mask thing to create a mask. Now I'm going to use a multiply layer, and I can just paint in a shadow tone in this group. Because it's masked, it will only affect, you can see like it doesn't go over the white. It only goes over this figure. And now I have, some rudimentary shadows for this character. And no matter which version I click on, the shadows stay the same, right? Like the shadow placement is going to stay the same. So very quickly, you can make a bunch of different versions with shadows in place. Now, you can also do the same thing with lights. You could use screen. What I like to do is use linear dodge and use a fairly dark tone. And what happens is it lightens it up and it changes depending on what color you're on. So let's say he had a very shiny nose. Okay, we can do stuff like that. And again, you change the versions and that's maintained. So that's the gist of the technique part of it. But the more interesting thing, I think, is really getting interesting colors, colors that are unexpected. So here, I just have random colors. It's pretty awful, I mean, it depends. Maybe it's not awful to you. That's fine. But they're pretty crazy colors, I would say. And so you can work with that and sort of start with these very crazy colors, just like we did here, and then find your colors. But one of the things I also like to do is just create kind of like the first time I create colors, the first color scheme I create, rather, I should say, it's the most obvious thing I can think of. So what would that be in this context? Well, let's just do it. So let's say I'm looking at this character, pretend, the colors are just, could be anything. Maybe I would think like, okay, let's give her brown hair. And you might notice there's also these circles around. Those are there for reference purposes. So, sometimes when you have shadows on things, here I have that shadow group. So this is what it looks like without any shadows. This is what it looks like with shadows and some highlights. It can be difficult to see exactly what that color is in a shadow area. Like you can see this area here, you've got this is the color, this is the shadow. So if I want to pick that specific color, it can be a bit tricky. So what I do is I have everything kind of separated on these circles, so I can just fill any of these circles and it will fill all of them. And the reason that works is because on my fill tool, I have contiguous turn off. So if I had contiguous turned on, for instance, what would happen is, I'll just show you. So here, contiguous is turned off. So any place this color is gets replaced. Here, if it's on, just this area gets replaced. So just where I click. So we want it off for most cases. Sometimes you want it on, but usually you want it off. Okay, so let's go back to coloring this character with very, expected colors. And in this case, you can just, you think about the color and you kind of put it down. Again, don't worry if it's not perfect, because this technique is designed to work with not perfect. And so I'm just going to put down, let's say she has green eyes. Okay. And let's see, what should her jacket be? Let's say just like a leather jacket. Okay, and maybe pants are like this. And generally, I just want to get the expected thing out of the way so it's kind of out of your system. It's usually easiest to work on something when you've tried different, like you've tried the most obvious thing, then it's actually easier to come up with unique things. And I'll show you what I mean and how that is done. So first thing, we just need to get like obvious colors in. And okay, we're like pretty close. Let's say, okay, this is good for our purposes. All right, so we've got a color scheme down. Now, what you want to do is, first of all, let's see, is there anything we don't want to change? So, for instance, I don't want to change the, I'm going to change the colors, but I don't really want to change the white of the eye. I kind of want the white of the eye to always be white. I kind of want the teeth to always, be the same tone. So I'm going to select all of those, and I just held Shift and use the magic wand to select those areas. And I'm going to hit Control J. So what that means is I have these on their own layer now. So whatever I do to the colors underneath, these ones are going to stay the same. All right. So now I have these basic colors. So the first thing I want to do is evaluate. So look at these colors and ask yourself, what would I change? Like, what's working, what's not working? And now we're going to switch to not using this paint bucket to fill, but using the magic wand. And this is where the technique actually starts to teach you about color schemes and what works. So I don't think these bracers on her arm really work. The color looks too close to the skin color. It just doesn't feel interesting to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to magic wand select those colors, and I'm going to hit Control U to bring up the Hue Saturation slider. And this is what we basically use for determining the colors. So here we go. We have three categories. We have hue, which is a color, red, blue, whatever you think of as a color. When we talk about colors, that's hue usually. We have the saturation. So how rich is that color? No saturation is gray. Full saturation is the color at its most pure. And lightness, how light or dark is that? And those are the three sliders we have to adjust to get any color we want. Now, if you had a gray color, for instance, something that's desaturated, so I'll just fill this with gray. Now what's going to happen if I try to adjust the hue? There is no hue because gray has no color identity by itself. So what we have to do to change a color is give that gray a color identity. The way you do that is hit colorize, and now it's just going to add a color to that. And now you can go ahead and change the colors as we were doing before. So if it's not working, maybe you're using white, gray, black, something like that, just hit colorize and then it will work. Okay, so let's just pick something that works a bit better. Let's say this. Okay, so now we have a color scheme. It's very obvious, I guess, or maybe not obvious, but it works. It's not too crazy. It's fine. All right, that's the first step. Next thing we want to do is we treat that as version 1. So now we have our first version. Okay, now I'm going to Control J to duplicate that group. So again, we always want to be duplicating our versions rather than painting over them so that we have them as reference. You know, you might look at something and think, I really like this other version I did, but you don't have a backup. So it's great to have a backup. So we're always creating backups here. All right, so now we have the second version. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this layer with all the colors. I'm going to hit Control U. So I didn't select any one thing. That's the important thing. Like I'm not just picking the hair. I'm picking everything. And now this is where the kind of the magic happens. It's in just going around and changing this and finding interesting color combinations. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. You can see like here, the skin is purple. Maybe I don't want the skin to be purple, but that's okay because maybe, you know, in general, this color scheme might be very interesting. You know, I kind of like this color scheme. So, okay, now we've got 2 color schemes. We've got this one and this one. Of the 2, I prefer this one. And you can ask yourself, okay, well, what's not working, or what would I change, or is there anything that bothers me? And maybe I'm thinking, you know, like, what if she had a lighter jacket? So now I duplicated that, and we have another version. I'm gonna go into this and just play around with that. You know, what if her jacket was a different color? Now, this sliding, this whole thing that I'm doing with like sliding and picking colors, this is the part that you are actually training yourself to see colors. Because what happens, and to develop a color sense, like if you're somebody like I was always told when I was, you know, starting out, my colors kind of sucked. And color is very subjective. And it's also something that really people notice right away. So, you know, you walk into a room, if you like the color of the walls, it's something you immediately notice. If you dislike the colors of the walls, it's probably also something you immediately notice. Also with characters, if you have a very unique color scheme, it really goes a long way to making the audience remember your characters. And, you know, whether they like it or not, again, that's subjective. I found most people are okay with my color scheme, so that's good. But really, it's color that gives a huge identity to whatever you're working on. So it's very important. But anyway, so this type of sliding, what you're doing is you're actually giving your brain, your intuition, you're exposing it to a bunch of choices, way more than if I said, well, you know, I want a lighter jacket. Okay, let's make it that. Does it work? Yes, it works. But is this developing my color sense? I got to see 2 versions. I got to see this version and I got to see the lighter version. Whereas when I'm here, I'm not seeing 2 versions. Like even doing this, it's like, one, two, three. I'm seeing so many hundreds of versions just in sliding this back and forth. And that's where you develop the intuitive sense for these things. Like, just in seeing so many iterations, so many possibilities, and getting to choose which one works for you. So now, how do I choose which one is working? Because you'll notice, like, I'm sliding back and forth, and probably, you as an audience member may be thinking like, oh, stop. I really like this color scheme. This one is really interesting to me. That's the same thing I'm using for myself. So we all have a different a different guide, a different barometer, a different compass to determine what is working for us. And that's the thing you want to cultivate. So for me, it's a feeling in my gut that I get. I'll like slide, and when I see something that it's kind of, so I'm going back and forth, and it's almost like like a radar or something where it like pings, like boop, boop, boop. It's like, okay, so where did that happen? Where was that sense? And for me, every time I go around this area, I get like a little like, oh, that's interesting. So I'm thinking, okay, which part of it is interesting? So I look at this, for instance, and it's like, yeah, I like these colors. They look pretty cool. As I go around back and forth, I get more to this, and it's like, yeah, it's not quite as strong. And when I go more to the green, it's a bit like, this is fine, it works, but it feels too safe. So there's this like razor's edge feeling when it's working, but it's kind of not safe in a way. Like there's a little bit of excitement, like, oh, that's interesting. That's where I want to stay. That's where you want to kind of train yourself to be looking out for that feeling when it's like, okay, this is now kind of interesting. And for me, it's around here. I play with the saturation a bit, more or less. I play with the hue and something like this. So here's where my feeling is saying to go. Now, there's this thing is really, really ugly. It's really bothering me. So I'm going to just select that. And this is kind of what you want to do is you look for the areas that are bothering you, that aren't working, and you target those. So at first we were doing this huge, back and forth thing, and changing all the colors and making very wild swings. And then after, as you do more and more, what you're doing is much smaller changes. You're going to be kind of just figuring out, like, how can I make this work? So here I made it this bluish color, and you can see what's starting to happen, that this character is kind of being divided into this like greenish color and this bluish color. And then there's this pink, and the pink is repeated in the cheeks. So with the intuitive sense, this generally is what happens, is that as you do these changes, you start to find harmonies. At least that's how it's been for me. And so let's say this is another version. And so in a very short time, we have this version that I started with, a second version, a third version, a fourth version. Okay, let's make another version. And here I'm going to do another big swing. So I'm going to take this whole character and I'm just going to change it like pretty drastically. Let's say something like this. Okay, can I make this work? Now, my character happens to be an alien, so it doesn't matter that her skin is different colors. But let's say she was on Earth, so it does matter. And let's just try different skin tones that are a bit more human. All right. So again, this is a color scheme that, maybe you like it, maybe you hate it, but it's different. And then I can, again, ask myself, what's not really working? What might I change? Maybe I change this blue to maybe a more orange color. Maybe I change this. Something like that. Maybe the hair could be a bit different. Could go for a brown. That might work. Maybe dark. Okay, so now we have like another version. Let's just change this blue. Something like that. Okay, so you can see how this really works and how you can quickly iterate a bunch of things. Now, one of the things that may happen though is your colors may not be quite working together, especially between versions. Like sometimes you'll get a color scheme like this that works, but when you put it beside another color scheme like this, it might feel a bit out of place. That's fairly easy to correct. The way I do that is I create a new color balance layer, an adjustment layer in the same layer folder that I have my shadows. So that means it's affecting everything on the character. And I can go in these settings, and the more off your colors are, the more you have to kind of make big swings with this. But it's the same thing as the hue saturation. You can like move around and find what type of color balancing you want. And what this is doing is like, it's saying, for instance, it's divided into three things: shadows, midtones, and highlights. And it's saying anything darker than a certain value will be considered shadows. And what you're doing is you're pushing it either towards more red, more cyan, more green, more magenta, depending on how you slide these. So by doing that, by adding a little bit of red, for instance, to all the shadows, you're harmonizing them. And so every version you did will have a little bit of red in the shadows. And so they'll all start to go, they'll start to gel. It'll feel like they're all working together. So let's go through the midtones. Again, I'm doing this based on feeling. This is, it's pretty much the most important thing. You can do things based on theory, and it will take you to a certain point. Usually that point is something that is expected, something that, feels pretty safe, but not necessarily all that interesting. Whereas I've learned more and more that your intuition, the sense you get when you're just playing around, that tends to create way better designs. So here I can move some of the highlights, and now I have this where I turn it on and off. It's not making a huge difference, but it's kind of making enough difference where it takes the edge off. Anything that's not working suddenly now works. And so for me, having that color balance there, again, it's just another thing that can really help. So let's say with this one, I'm not liking this bracer object, and I preferred the color of this one, the original one. What we can do is we can just select that original color, go to our new one, take the paint bucket and just click, and it'll change that. So again, very easy to make these changes. And if I was just thinking about making like this, I would say is like a brownish foresty type, maybe deserty color scheme. If I was just thinking this and paint bucket dropping in colors, I probably wouldn't have this green. I wouldn't have this orange. I just wouldn't be thinking in a way that is as expansive. So it really can help to think outside the box. So let's do some more versions and just see, what we can do with this character. And this also is a good way of testing your designs. Like if your character design works on a bunch of different schemes, it pretty much works. Like that's a good sign that your character design is pretty strong. So I just want this thing to be the same no matter what. So I just filled that on the same layer as the teeth and the whites of the eyes. Okay, so let's make like maybe like a goth color scheme. So instead of just picking like, well, I'm gonna make her have black and white, like just black and white. That's the way we're going. Doing something like this where you're actually sliding and adjusting, you can find things that are a bit more like interesting, a bit more unexpected, but still have that feeling. So maybe I want to take this and I just want to desaturate the whole thing a little bit and maybe darken it all just a touch. Okay. So now I have this, but let's say I want to make, small adjustments now. So I've made the big adjustment. So now let's make the face fairly pale. I want those eyes to stand out. So I'm going to make them very intense color. And the more you do this, the more you just start to figure out what works, what doesn't work, why does it work, why doesn't it work, how can you change it, how can you adjust it. I look at these pants and I think that doesn't really scream goth, so let's go something dark. Again, I can like make small adjustments, figure out what I want to do. Maybe this is going to be a bit more punchy. So I also think about things like accent colors. So here I have, this currently green color, and I'm treating that as an accent. So I want some colors to be kind of different and punchier than others. I feel like this green on the shoes is not feeling too gothic. So let's change it. Yeah, we can go dark. Let's go red for some elements. So I say red and then I go to pink. The reason I do that is because I slide towards red and then it starts to feel like that doesn't quite work. And so looking at this, if you look at the colors, there's a lot of blues in everything. The face is slightly bluish, the hair is slightly bluish. So when I go to a pure red, it feels a bit too orange. And so I have to figure that in my head, like, okay, this feels too orange. I want to move it. So I can either move it towards the blues or towards the yellows. So obviously if it feels too orange, I don't want to move towards the yellows. That's the wrong direction. So I moved it towards the blue and it became more pink. So there, now we have kind of a pink, even though I think of red. So part of this is also dissociating from these terms that are very expected, like calling colors by their names. I don't actually know specifically what this color is. I slide back and forth and I find a color, but I'm not 100% sure just exactly what this color is, but that's fine because it works. And now I think this color works, but the problem is it's blending in too much with the background. So luckily I have the background on its own layer. And what I can do is make a hue saturation adjustment layer on top of this background. And now I can do the same thing for the background that I did for the rest of the colors. And we just sort of find a color scheme that works with the rest of what we're doing. So in this case, I kind of grade it out so that everything pops out a bit more. It's easier to see. And now we have this color scheme that's, again, it's a little more goth. It's still got interesting areas of color that are not necessarily what you might expect. Maybe you want to change some of it. Kind of like that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It acts as a good contrast. The other thing you want to keep in mind is where is the viewer's eye going? So the belt and the pants are kind of close in value because I don't necessarily want you to look here. I don't necessarily want you to look at the sleeve, but the color is right around her face. So it's kind of like a frame, like a photo frame. So I do want the viewer to look there. And that's why I made that a punchier color so it stands out. So it works with leading the eye. So that's another thing that's very important to consider is where do you want the viewer to look, and you use colors accordingly, because we could do a bunch of stuff. So for instance, let's say I wanted a gradient on these pants. Well, all I do is I select the pants, make a new layer, and I can actually don't want to select all of these. So I'm going to hit contiguous on, and I'm going to hold down Alt and deselect these. Oops. Okay. Contiguous off, select the pants, contiguous on, deselect these two because I don't want to change those. Go on a new layer, gonna get a gradient, and let's say she's got a gradient here. Like her pants have a gradient. All right, like that might be very cool. And honestly, I think it looks fine. However, and again, because it's on its own layer, we can like totally change it up. However, what it's doing that you may not want is it's creating this very strong pull to look down. So my eye is settling here at her calf. And when I look at the thumbnail, it reads as a character. And maybe this is good if you have a game where the character is very small on the screen. And they're just running around and stuff. This could be a good attention grabbing thing. But if your character was big, that might not be the best move, because now all your attention is being driven down instead of here near the face where you might want the character to, or the viewer to look. So it really depends on what you're doing. But I do think it looks cool. So if there was like a game where you were seeing the character from far, I think this is a good option. All right, so basically that's the gist of it. And now I'm going to take some questions. So if you have any questions, you can just type them in the Slido thing. Okay, so I have a question. Would you please make your talk accessible later? I'd love to follow at my own pace. I don't know. I think like that's not on me, but I hope they make them accessible. Do you think your methods would work for more photorealistic and gradient heavy arts? Also, what do you think about using it for environment design? Yeah, definitely. I mean, here we just saw a gradient example. The thing to keep in mind is that, let's say I wanted this more realistic. The easiest way to do that, let me just make a duplicate. Easiest way is usually in the case of a color scheme like this, I lower the lightness a bit. I usually lower or raise the saturation, but that tends to give you a more realistic look when the colors are closer together. So you don't want such big jumps between colors. And so by lowering the lightness and lowering the saturation a bit, I'm creating a bit more of a mature color palette. Also, I have the shadows on their own layer. And if I wanted to create a more realistic look, what I've done with these shadows is they are let me just change it to a normal layer. They are this pink, and it's going to give you a very cartoony feel because they're so pink. When I set it to multiply, it creates this very like aesthetically pleasing look. But again, very cartoony. So one of the things you could do is, rather than use the pink type of shadows, I can select this layer with all the shadows on, and it's in my group with the mask, so it's only going to affect what's in this character. And I can make a new hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm just going to turn off the original shadows. So nothing's showing up here yet because we have this on, but we haven't done anything to it. But now if I go darker, you can see it's adding shadows to this character. See? Whoop. And I can increase or decrease the saturation. I can shift it. Maybe I want more of like a blue tone here. Maybe not so blue, but I can adjust this, and that's going to create a little more of a realistic look. Of course, as your style is more realistic, you have more details. So for instance, this face is a little more realistic than this face. So let's say I wanted to render this face more. Okay, so I have this all on its own layer with the shadows right here. So what I could actually do is I can take a smudge tool, basically anything that you're not actually painting paint on here. We're just working with a mask, but I could take a smudge tool and I can start to create soft transitions. See? Like now we're getting much more soft color variation. And so you can definitely use this. And if I want to create, like, let's say I wanted some cheek definition, I can use a big soft brush and some white and start painting and actually get those subtle transitions. So now the cheek is kind of, turning, and we're getting a lot more realistic with the detail. And I could make this darker as well, and enhance that. So we this is just an exaggeration, so it's easier to see. But just to give you that sense where yes, you can do that. You can even add color variation if you want. But because it's in its own group, no matter which color I switch to, it remains. Like that subtle shading still remains. So, sometimes there's this feeling like you don't want to put in too much detail in any one variation, because if you painted that on its own layer, you have to do that every single time for all the versions, and maybe you don't want to do that. But in this method, you totally can, so long as you're just using layer modes and things like that. in the group. So go ahead and do that. And I'll add some color, like let's say I wanted some color variation that's global, that affects all of them. Maybe I want it so in the cheeks, it always gets a little bit red. So what I can do is make a new layer, set it to overlay, pick like a red-ish color and like paint that in here on the cheeks, maybe on the lips. We could do something like, maybe there's a bit of a color dodge in the eyes so the eye really stands out like that. Maybe here, I can add some little details. And again, it will affect all of the different options. So all of them would get this kind of extra cheek thing because it's overlay and not like a straight up pink. The pink or red, it's actually slightly changing depending on which color scheme I use. So it always looks right. Like it always fits. Just like, yep, that fits. Try a different color scheme. Yep, that fits. So that's something you can do. And you can take that as far as you want. I also have the lines on their own color. So, I mean, on their own layer. So if I wanted to change the line art here, I could do that too, where I can like adjust the colors of that. If you're going for something more realistic, chances are you don't want like very saturated line art, maybe something a little more subtle. But this definitely does work for more realistic styles. Okay, so just notice this green is very, very eye-catching, a bit too much for what I want. So let's go ahead and change it. Again, super easy. Just select, well, I think I've got contiguous on. Yep. Select it. Try to pay attention to that feeling you get when it starts to feel like, yeah, we're onto something here. And again, as you do this more, it does get easier to know what is working, what is not working, and making adjustments like that. So are there any other questions? If not, I will just do more schemes until we run out of time, because why not? All right, let's do some more. And see what's hiding in here. What's something we haven't done? Let's do like a very pastel color, like very light, like that. But let's give her darker skin. All right. Now, I just noticed the white is very intense with the overlay. We could change that or run with it. Maybe it's fine. And maybe I want to switch back to the other background color so this stands out more. And just play around. Maybe the hair could be well, it's really strong. But try not to prejudge too much. Like if you find something's like a bit off, spend a little bit of time in that discomfort and ask yourself, why do I feel that way? Why is this so off? Let's go with this, but then change this hair color. Okay, and maybe the eyes are getting lost a bit, so I'm gonna darken the eyes. I actually really like this combination for the eye. It's very interesting. So again, you can do these things and just like figure out stuff that you never would have thought of otherwise because you just weren't pushing yourself enough. I want to make your hair a bit darker. Okay. All right. Well, that's basically it. A bunch of versions. Thanks very much for listening to my talk, and I hope it helped.